Hey everybody, it's Albert. And in this video, I'm going to be making some comments on the atmosphere surrounding the recent exchange between Thunderfoot and the Cartesian Theists relating to the contributions to philosophy of one William Lane Craig. I will admit the title of this video, What's a William Lane Craig? I remember this from a few months ago when I was looking at various videos that involved William Lane Craig when this whole thing had heated up before, and I saw one comment in one of the videos, and I'm sorry I've forgotten what video or who made the comment, but it just said, what's a William Lane Craig? And I think that's a good starting point for this discussion, because one of the things I found is that those who are making comments on William Lane Craig on both sides in terms of his contributions to philosophy have absolutely no idea what he has or has not contributed, and have absolutely no idea if he is or is not a good philosopher, and have absolutely no idea if other philosophers do or do not respect him, and are in no position to do any of the above. That basically these are decisions made entirely upon apologetics issues that are irrelevant to his status as a philosopher. And I'm not going to say I'm in any better position than they are, but then I'm not going to be trying to make decisions based on my own opinion, but try to make some sense of his past or whatever. In terms of whether or not the terms I've seen thrown about as respected philosopher or world-class philosopher, I'm not going to get into world-class philosopher because that sort of gets into sort of star status things that I'm not particularly interested in. When you start dealing with world-class philosophers, to me that's kind of like raising the bar up to and a lot of that gets very subjective. But I just want to get whether or not he's considered a respected philosopher, whether other philosophers in a lot of cases would respect his work in his field, whether he's considered part of the community of philosophical scholars or whatever. So the arguments I've seen against that seem to, well, the ones that, particularly those promoted by Thunderfoot, I find incredibly fallacious. And that does, and by the way, by saying that doesn't mean William Lane Craig, that does not imply he is a good philosopher. That implies that Thunderfoot's arguments are fallacious, and that's it. And I want to deal with those, the whole H-index thing, which is, to me, a complete zero argument, and I'll explain why in a minute. But then you have to still deal with the issue of whether, is there anything that a amateur like myself or others can make some sense of whether or not Craig has that position. Now, first let's deal with Thunderfoot's H-index argument, and here I'm just going to assume everyone knows, I'm speaking to those who've followed this whole debate, so I'm not going to recycle the whole thing. But the reasons I find it fallacious is because it's the apples and oranges thing. He's comparing people who are scientists and their H-index versus people who are philosophers. A number of problems with this. Science, by its very nature, works on prior experiments. So any scientific paper is probably going to cite any number of previous scientific papers because they're experiments. Either the experiments succeeded or they failed, and they're citing these because they're building upon an existing base of knowledge. So you're going to be citing more papers, and if more papers are being cited in any given scientific paper, then more scientists on average are going to have more citations. That's just the nature of the beast. In the humanities, things don't necessarily work that way. Generally, you may not find many papers being cited, except perhaps in the case where someone's responding to someone else's argument. Or you would find a higher number of citations in a paper that was an historical survey of the state of a particular debate, where they were drawing in, at this point this person said this and this person said that, etc. but generally you're not going to find nearly as many citations in the papers from the humanities than you would in a scientific paper. And you know, someone could make, to just give you an example, the sort of argument that someone could make the other way to make Thunderfoot look bad. And here I'm going to specify this argument's fallacious also, but just to show you how things could be turned, someone could look at Thunderfoot and say, you know, all these papers I see that are by him that have been, at least I'm dealing with the ones that have been discussed in the video that are by Thunderfoot. It seems like there's always like 4 or 5 names. Can't this guy do anything by himself? That's a fallacious argument, because if you're familiar with any scientific literature, things like experiments tend to be done by teams rather than necessarily just one individual. You'll see lots of teamwork involved whereas in the humanities you'll see one individual writing a paper. So that right away, you know, but you could see how someone could make a fallacious argument the other way. So again, when you deal apples and oranges, it's not a fair comparison. The other thing is that in humanities, the things that are cited the most are not, I repeat, are not individual papers, but are in fact tend to be books. In a lot of cases, individual papers are bits and pieces that are building the way up to making a book, and it's generally the books that are things that get cited, whereas it's the exact opposite in the sciences, where things are built in stages, cumulatively, paper by paper by paper. So right away, the whole argument Thunderfoot used just collapses. And to me, it's indicative of the missteps he makes once he leaves his particular area, the sciences, and goes anywhere else. I mean, I could any number of examples in the past. One that I made a video on, which I found incredibly amusing, was when Thunderfoot was speaking against making an argument on biblical metaphors being bad. He cited Abraham Lincoln and the metaphor Abraham Lincoln used when the house divided, not realizing that Abraham Lincoln was actually using a metaphor from the Bible. That was one of my favorites. And then, of course, there was the whole Jezebel thing, if you remember that from one of Thunderfoot's videos about the Bible. He thought that this was somehow saying Jesus was going to kill this woman and her children, not realizing Jezebel was a metaphor. It's an Old Testament figure from 800 years earlier, the wife of Ahab, who was sort of a symbol for apostasy, in the same way someone might say that Benedict Arnold or that Judas, and you would know exactly you're talking about someone traitorous or a betrayer. Same thing with Jezebel, was a symbol for apostasy, and it had nothing to do with some woman and her children. It was an apostate and their followers. But stuff like, I mean, obviously he's had a tin ear for that sort of thing, that are out, because he's used to dealing with a very literal field. So it's things where things are just taken at face value with the experiments, whereas when you're dealing with anything that involves literature, things are not necessarily exactly as they are as they seem at the surface level. Now, all that being said, has absolutely nothing to do with whether William Lane Craig is or is not a respected person in his field. So let's go a little bit deeper and see if we can have any hint as to whether he is or is not. And one thing I would reference is, if you look at the list of books, and I think they're probably on Wikipedia or whatever, it's very easy to separate the popular apologetics ones from the scholarly ones. It's blindingly obvious. And I've noticed a number of these scholarly books that he's written are published by some pretty respected scholarly publishers. Edward Mellon, Kluwer Academic, Brill, Oxford University Press. Somehow they managed to agree to publish his books. Someone who I think most people would say is a respected philosopher, Quentin Smith, co-wrote a book with William Lane Craig on the philosophical implications of cosmology, where they each took a turn making their arguments. Quentin Smith's an atheist, and so they were having this academic discussion between them on an exchange on the philosophical implications of cosmology. I can't imagine Quentin Smith would be doing that with, say, Lee Strobel. I just don't see that happening. I could be wrong, but I don't really see it happening. In another case, actually, besides that book, Quentin Smith and William Lane Craig were called upon by Oxford University Press to serve as co-editors of a book or a collection of papers, contributions from various people. One of the common thing in humanities academia where they all write papers for a collection on a specific theme. This one dealing with philosophical implications of relativity theory. Somehow Craig managed to convince Oxford University Press that he knew something about this topic and was respected in that field, and these other publishers seem to think he was, and he's been published in philosophical journals and on 3 continents, and Quentin Smith seems to think he's really good. And the problem I have with the people saying he's totally inept or a zero is that all this stuff says something different. Now, what they would have to argue is that the entire peer review process, everything that goes on in terms of, that somehow it broke down for this one guy, that William Lane Craig did his magic and somehow conned Quentin Smith into thinking he knew something, somehow conned Oxford University and Brill and all these other people into publishing his stuff. It doesn't seem to be a very good argument. So I tend to lean that, it doesn't mean he's the best philosopher in the world, but certainly it does seem that he is respected in this field, and the fact that he's been published by these people sort of, and the things he's done in the past sort of argues against the very point that these people are making, and given the ones making this point really are in no position to know, I tend to go with the yes, he is respected. Whether he's whether he's one of the top guys or the middle guys or whatever, or an average guy, I don't know. But to say he's not it's simply you're arguing against the evidence, which is a kind of an odd thing for someone who claims he's a scientist. Okay, thank you very much for your time.